Good evening and welcome. Welcome to That's the Law. We're back. I'm BJ Krintzman. We are here in the studio, and we're taping this on April 25th. And this is the first time we have been in studio since, let me get the date, since February 25th of 2020. So it's 3 years and 2 months since we've been in the studio. Wow. And it feels so great to be back, and welcome to you, Newton, for being there for us. And I want to I don't usually do this, but at the outset, I'm going to give a shout out to John Fremer, who has just been supportive and wonderful through this. And we did a bunch of shows on Zoom before, during the pandemic and while we weren't in the studio. And I also want to give a shout out to Kathleen Golden, who's here in the studio. She's the jack of all trades of everything, takes care of everything. And she's been after me and said, come on, come back in. So she was right, as always, all along. And we're now back. Anyway, so we've got a very exciting show for tonight to start off I think it's our 27th season. I want you to join me in welcoming Jill Ebstein. Jill, welcome.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Nice to have you back, because you were on the show in 2017, I think.
I think that's right, for the At My Pace series.
I have that someplace, but I don't know where it is right now. Anyway, but that's right, we had you then, and I really like that we are beginning the season with this show, because Jill is here because she wrote her most recent book is called Alfred's Journey to be Liked. And I like that it's about a journey, because I feel like we're on a journey, yes, starting our next season and starting our shows after the post-pandemic. So anyway, you here, I've got it now, May 10th, 2017. So it's almost exactly 6 years ago that you were here.
And we look the same.
And we look exactly the same, which is just one of those fluky things. And your book that we talked about then was called Lessons from Our Mothers.
Right.
And that was more a compilation of essays that
sons and daughters wrote short pieces about one lesson they took from their mother and how that made all the difference. So that was that. But this is my first piece of fiction this go around, so this is a whole different ball of wax.
Well, all right, so the impetus for this show was actually Jill called me, or texted me, emailed me, whatever, and said, I have a new book. I'd like to come on the show. So first of all, I'm so thrilled anybody will even come on the show if I beg them, let alone offer to come on. So that was how it began. And I said to her, well, I happened to be in New York at that time, and I said, will you drop the book off at my house in Newton, and I'll read it when I get back. So I read it when I got back, and then I sent her an email, and the subject line, the Ray line of the email was, wow. Right?
Yes. Oh. You made my night.
Right. So, I basically said, when are you available to come on? So this was really a book I wanted to talk about. So Jill, first of all, before we get into the book, remind our viewers about you, who you are, your background.
Sure. So I'm actually mostly a business and marketing consultant, but I talk to people all the time, and I try to understand what they feel, what they're thinking, what's happening inside their thought process. And on the side, I've been writing, but I love to write. And so more and more over time, I've been shifting towards writing. And this is really, this book happens to be a lot about how we communicate and how we pick up on communication, which I think is pretty core to sort of what I've been doing in my professional life, only this time it's been applied to writing a book.
When did you start writing this book, by the way?
Early in COVID.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. I was on the Medium platform. And you write pieces on Medium, and I noticed that everybody was complaining that they weren't getting much attention, they weren't being liked enough, they weren't getting enough claps. That's how it started. And I wrote a piece that made fun of us as writers. But I decided how funny would it be to be a teen boy who's not feeling liked. And I wrote this piece saying basically this could be us. And they thought it was so funny, and they clapped a lot. And then I wrote a second piece about that.
Right.
And then I wrote 39 pieces.
Yeah.
And that was how Alfred happened.
And that's how Alfred was born, I guess. Yeah, I have to ask you to describe this book. You called it a novel, okay? When I read it, and this is the reason I said, wow, one of the reasons was I wasn't sure if it was a novel, if it was a screenplay, if it was an instruction manual, if it was a course outline for professionals who deal with neurodivergent children,
Right.
or if it was a primer for how to live your life. So it was, and it's sort of all of those things in some way.
Yeah. Okay, so first of all, you're right. It's all those things. It's actually, the real genre is called literary genre, which means it focuses on a character versus a plot. It's not very plotty. It is looked at as a sort of a coming-of-age story. I did not think that the 14-year-old was neurodivergent when I wrote it. I thought he was just a quirky guy like the rest of us are quirky. And I wrote it as sort of a social boot camp for the population at large. But I had some very good beta readers, a lot of them. It was therapists, educators, clergy, friends, parents. And I mean, they said, he's on the spectrum. How can you not see he's on the spectrum? And so once I knew that I had to declare it, even because that made it easier for them to understand him, then I went with that. But that was never really my original intent. And what I was hoping was for us, the population at large, we could actually remember some basic social rules that will help us do better at connecting. It turns out that when you apply it to a neurodivergent character, it has even more pop. And I also think it was a way for me to sort of inject some positivity that we can actually be better than we are if we sort of just do a few small things.
Oh, absolutely. And something resonated with me also. There's a book called Everything I Needed to Know I Learned in kindergarten or
right.
something like that. And that it was all here. It's basic, and we've gotten away from it, or we've forgotten it, or we've never articulated it.
Right.
So let's talk a little bit about one of the things that happens in, you described your impetus for the book, but in the book, Alfred is basically, he's 14, and his mother hires a coach for
Right.
him.
He's quite content. He has his chess, he has his math problems, he has baseball stats. He's very brainy, very stats oriented. His mother says, but we need some friends for you. And he's like, I'm fine. And she said, you are fine, but you could be better. And so she brings Coach into Alfred's life. And Alfred, because he's a sweet guy, agrees to give Coach a one-digit number of sessions.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And so this is why I said that I wasn't sure if it was a screenplay, because it's all dialogue, essentially. And it's either between Alfred and the coach, or the coach and the mother, or Alfred and his mother. It's just sort of these dialogues with sort of some stage directions, which Alfred says with a smile, or
Right.
I actually wrote down a few of the stage directions, but so I wasn't sure if you wanted it to be acted out, or why you were putting in.
Right.
Alfred smiles when he said, let's say the stage direction, Alfred smiles when he says that.
Right. That's a great question. So first of all, I was extremely aware of how long people's attention spans are, because I know from Medium and from places I write that like 4 minutes is a sweet spot that I can hold people's attention, and after 4 minutes they start to drift. So I needed to pack a lot into 4 minutes, but not go much over 4 minutes, so I would have their attention. So that's why there's no description of sunset or what they're wearing or any of that stuff. It's very action-centric. But I do want some content that's just sort of your basic writing to sort of set the stage. So I have at the end the mother and the coach, usually that's in paragraphs. And then sometimes it'll say like Alfred smiles. I want the reader to know that he sort of finds it amusing, versus saying Alfred found this amusing. There's like a little italic which sort of says to you, oh, he found it funny,
Right, of what happened. And so we have the coach in on this, and the basic thing is for Alfred to make friends and to become more socially adept. And how this is played out is through 10 lessons that are being taught to Alfred.
Right.
And the first lesson is, go ahead, talk about the first lesson.
Don't be a no-betterer. So Alfred knows stats. He knows he knows so much stuff. He's that very, very brainy kid. And Coach says to him, so what happens when you meet people? And Alfred says, well, I try to find out what they're interested in, and when I know their hobby, then I try to tell them something about it, like I pull out some numbers. And so Coach is like, you do what? He said, well, if they like that hobby, I think I can help them know a little more about their hobby. And Coach says that's not the right thing to do, because that makes you out to be the person who's the know-betterer, the person who always know better about things. Instead, ask them questions and find out more about them. And he says, and so Coach says, until Alfred says, well, so when I ask questions and they give me the wrong answer, which is oftentimes what will happen, can I correct them? He said, no, you cannot. That's being a know-betterer again. You just have to let them shine too. So that's the first lesson, which is to actually hold back and let other people talk and not always try to win with more data and more analysis. So that was the first one. And because he's so literal and so smart and so invested in the things he knows about, it's so easy for him to give data. So
Right.
he has to pull that back.
Yeah, this is a kid who's a chess player, who's very
Yes.
math-oriented.
Correct.
And he does everything in terms of numbers
Yes.
and percentages and what's the
Yes.
chances of this or that.
Yes.
Yeah. A fascinating kid. Is there any correlate to Alfred in your life, or did you just make him up out of whole cloth?
I made him up. I mean, I do have some sort of quant jocks in my family, but nothing like Alfred.
Quant jocks.
yeah.
I've never heard that before.
But Alfred is like, a supreme example. So
Yeah.
it's kind of made up, but there's a little bit of a basis for that.
An exaggeration. And then Alfred takes the lessons, and there's something ultimately incredibly fascinating about this kid, which is that he takes the lessons and he incorporates them right away. And he takes them, maybe because he's so literal.
He's very literal. So Coach says the second lesson is to have empathy, but he describes it as wearing somebody's shoes, which we've heard it before, put on somebody's shoes. So for Alfred, he sees a basketball player at lunch, one of his friends, and he says, can I put on your high tops? Yeah. And then it turns out he realizes they're so uncomfortable, he can't dribble a basketball, because Alfred's not athletic at all. So he says to Coach, it was literal and I learned something. It was literal because I really need his high tops on. I realized they're tight, he runs tight, and I learned that I can't play basketball at all. So, and I guess that wasn't really the point, but
The third lesson,
Mm-hmm.
I loved this lesson. This important to hear people's unspoken words.
Yeah. So that to me is sort of, I say to people is do a personal inventory of what you do well and what you don't do well when you read these lessons, and that sort of helps you as an individual improve your game. So for me, hearing unspoken words, that bubble, the things that people are thinking but not saying, is so important, being able to pick up signals. I'm sure, BJ, you do that all the time. You can read what people are thinking even if they're not actually saying it. So, of course, for Alfred, that's hard because he's so literal. But there's lots of things he wants to actually understand about his mom that he can't quite get, and if he heard the unspoken word, it would help him a lot. So Coach gives him some thoughts about how you actually can tell what people are thinking. Some of it is like, is there a disconnect between what they're saying and what you know of them that the logic doesn't hold? Do they make eye contact? How's the body language? And so you see him try to work with that, and it's funny, but he actually does start to realize, he starts to pick up on signals. So yeah, that to me was one of those that I feel like is a thing that I can own. The know better for me is a little harder because I feel like I know a lot of things.
Right.
But
right. We won't go through all 10, but the fourth one was learning ways to be generous. That matters the most.
The spirit of generosity. Yeah.
Yeah.
So Alfred doesn't have any money. He's very literal. When Coach says the spirit of generosity, he's like, spirits aren't even real. How could they be generous? And if they were real, they'd have less money than me. So Coach says it's about finding ways to give that make people feel recognized and connected. And so he plays with this some, and he makes his mom breakfast one day to be generous to her. And so he laughs because his making generous was he smelled the milk to make sure it wasn't spoiled. He poured her the cereal. He got her OJ, and he brought her one of the cookies that she bakes for him. He put on a napkin for her for afterwards. So that was his being generous. But he also finds the biggest way he's generous, as you know, is later on. He makes a friend with Hannah. Hannah is like a very straight-A, smart kid. She writes this play. She needs a narrator for the play. He wants nothing to do with the play. He's not a center stage kind of guy. He has a great memory. And she says, Alfred, I need you. I need you for the kids on the, who won't remember their lines. I need you. And he said, well, can I just make you Soho globs? I mean, there's things I can do for you, these cookies that you'll like, that will make you happy. I need you. And so he thinks about it, and then he ends up stepping up to do that. And so he says to Coach, I never intended to be that generous, but I guess that's what you mean when you talk about being generous.
How did you come up with the 10 lessons that you came up with?
So what happened was I wrote the book, and I actually did not identify the lessons I had them in there, but I didn't pull them out. So 2 things happened with my readers. One thing happened was the readers said, we need them numbered. I need to know what the lessons are by number, because that's how I'm going to remember them. That was one thing that happened. And the second thing that happened was, this is not a spoiler alert, but I'm just going to sort of give a small hint, which is Alfred is raised by a single mom, and you never know anything about the dad. And I didn't want to deal with the dad's storyline. Okay, but all the therapists and the clergy said you cannot have somebody in therapy for a year and not deal with the missing dad. It just doesn't happen. It doesn't have the ring of truth to it. So I had to go back. This was 3 revisions I had on this book, and I had to create a whole storyline that dealt with the dad, which I actually really love that storyline. But it wasn't something I ever wanted to do. I just was sort of cornered.
Shamed into it.
Exactly.
Well, they were knowing better than you were.
Exactly.
That's what it was.
Yeah.
Why a reset is not a checkout when it comes to self-care.
Right.
How do you come up with this? Go ahead.
Well, so they did such a good job with Alfred of getting him back with friends, and he started a chess club. That was a way to get friends involved and not have to talk that much. And then he was doing the play, and then he realized he just was over the top with people, right? And so he was getting really irritable. And so Coach said, well, you actually need to press the reset. You need to go home and relax. Don't deal with people. Just, he has a favorite a character named Naruto, an anime character he loves to watch television, and he does all kinds of stuff like that. So that was I need to just decompress. And I didn't know that I needed that until I needed that. And so now I know, and then Coach says, and now that you know that, next time you can get ahead of it so it doesn't come crashing down on you.
Right, and Coach gives him permission.
Correct.
To reset, and
Correct.
that it's okay to do that.
Correct.
Yep. We'll just do this last one, dogs. Let's talk about dogs.
Oh my gosh. Well, anybody who knows me knows that I love dogs. And some people who've read this book say, well, we feel like it's just an exploration of you. But I felt like for Alfred, he is the kind of kid who would really benefit from a dog. He doesn't have a sibling. He has a very intuitive, smart mom who's also probably on the spectrum. I don't know if you picked up on that, but she's just a mature version of him. And I think that dogs just seem like such a natural fit in terms of a companion, instinctive love, all that kind of stuff. So, and it gave me a chance to bring a dog into the story and to also showboat a little bit of my knowledge of dogs and to just create love, so yeah.
And that rule is how dogs simply make the world better.
They do.
That's what that is.
Yeah.
Also in the book, if we could just talk a little bit, you invent words.
I do invent words.
You invent words and concepts. So one of them is popposites.
Love popposites.
Popposites. Like opposite, but big, sort of with a P. Popposites. Tell Newton what popposites are.
Okay, so the way that Hannah, who's the creator of popposites, describes it is, let's just say your grandma died, and you're crying because she died, and you miss her so much, and then you start telling grandma stories, and she was quite funny, and you start laughing at her funny moments or her stories, and then all at once you're both crying and laughing at the same time. Or it's that teacher that you might have in school who seems like sort of a curmudgeon and not very nice, but underneath it all is just a really warm, caring teacher, right? So we had recently had Passover, and my brother said, we need you to bring something to the Seder table, a piece of knowledge or a piece of something. So I said, let's discuss popposites about Passover. The biggest popposite to me on Passover is that Moses never is mentioned in the Haggadah once, not even once, and he led the Jews, and so out of Egypt. So how do you figure out that our leader can't even be mentioned once? That's a popposite. And the thing about popposites is it really adds meaning to almost everything it does, because you see things in contrast and you see the richness of the range, the layers that the things have in our life, that you can feel one way and another way about the same thing, and they both are true. And so I say with Alfred, if he sees people that way, his mother, she's annoying and he loves her, like all moms. There's a lot of aspects to where opposites help us understand.
And what I've said for years is the good news often is the bad news. It's not that there's good news and there's bad news.
Right.
It's all smushed up in the same. It's the
Right.
good news, but it's also the bad news.
That's the opposite, exactly.
That's what I'm saying. So that was my way of expressing what opposites are. There's a pearl of wisdom in here, and I read it and I reread it and I reread it, which is that the concept of when your anger doesn't know its home.
I use that a lot in my life. Well, sometimes it's really misplaced anger, and the way what Alfred is struggling with, the fact that Hannah, who seems to have everything going for her, is very quick to get angry at things and be terse. And so he says to her, Hannah, what's going on? And she said, I don't know, I'm angry. And so he talks to Coach, and Coach says, well, see if her anger knows its home. What's the origin of it? And so I think that sometimes things happen to us, and rather than attacking that exact issue that's why I'm angry, you put it somewhere else. You put it to places that either feel safer or comfortable, and it doesn't help you because you're not actually getting to the root of the anger, and you've probably hurt somebody else in the process. I think it's a real, it's an honest thing that we all feel sometimes.
Oh, yeah, displaced, and it happened to me just the other day. I don't even remember now what it was, but I exploded at somebody, and it had very little to do with what that person, it was disproportionate for what had happened.
Right.
And I tried to think about what happened today that put me in such an angry mood, and my anger didn't know its proper home. It just was displaced.
But that was such a healthy reaction that you asked yourself that question, because oftentimes when people have those moments, they don't even realize it.
Right. You're too angry because you're too angry to get yourself out of it.
Yeah.
I have to tell you that while I was reading this book, and to me it was about a neurodivergent 14-year-old and all these lessons and what he has to do to make friends and be more popular and get his social act together, let's say. And at some point, Jill, I'm reading this, I said, wait a minute, is she talking to me? Is she talking to me? And I started to see the universality of these concepts. And it wasn't just about how to help a 14-year-old.
Right.
This was how to help a person live their life.
Well, thank you. That is actually what I was hoping in my wildest dreams. I hope that will help some people. I mean, it helps me as I was writing this. I had moments where I think Alfred's made me sometimes a nicer person, like a little more aware person than I was before.
Yeah.
So
it's just fabulous. Now, this just we're going to have to wrap up in a few minutes, but this is self-published. Is that right?
Yep.
How does it get to look like a book? What do you?
Oh, it's a lot of. We have to have a lot of hands involved. I have to have somebody design a cover. I have to have somebody lay it out. I have to have somebody, look for editing. There's a lot of stuff that's involved. I've done this before, so I have sort of a lot of the hands.
Yeah.
And the thing that you don't know is that actually this is a sequel. So Alfred is the first book on his journey to be liked, but Hannah, it follows on her journey to be happy. And so I have to have these people. And the third one is on Joey, who's.
Oh, there will be a sequel, is what you're saying. Oh,
yeah.
okay.
I've actually written the second one. I just not going to.
And Newton, did you happen to notice that our guest, Jill Ebstein, is wearing the colors of her book?
Yes.
This was. No one told her to do this, and colors are important in the books, and you kind of.
Yes. So at one point when Alfred has his candid conversation with his mother, she says, "Do you have favorite colors?" Which he says no. And she says, I do. They're blue and green. And the reason why is she grew up in a fairly lonely childhood, lying on the grass, looking at the sky, and trying to just sort of